Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my friend from Texas. I thank the witnesses for being here. I don't want to cover stuff that's already been covered, and I apologize for flight getting here as fast as I could. But I think, Mr. McClintock, a question for you about the 4 bills that are before us. We're dealing here with respect to all 4 of them with individuals who are present in the United States by virtue of having come here without papers. Is that correct? No? What is the classification of people in all 4 bills of the people we're dealing with here?
It applies to both legal and illegal immigrants in many of the bills. And just very simple reasoning, and that is, if you're a guest in this country, we ask that you obey our laws. And if you are not going to obey our laws, we need to show you the door.
We're dealing with non-citizens in all 4?
Correct.
Are we dealing with LPRs in each or all of the 4?
Yeah.
Legal permanent residents?
So. Yeah, I believe so, yes.
But they've been given that status by virtue of our efforts as a country to say you can come here.
They are guests in this country.
Provided that you would follow the laws of this country, correct? Are the people that we're dealing with here with respect to all 4 of these bills, however, in significant numbers, we're dealing with a lot of people who are here illegally?
Of course,
here,
well, especially,
right.
For example, at the border chases that are imperiling lives and killing law enforcement officers.
And in most cases, with respect to Social Security fraud.
Oh, yes.
Right, by definition.
Yeah, exactly.
So to be clear for the people watching at home, we are moving legislation to try to deal with, in some cases, legal permanent residents or people who are here who have been given legal status by virtue of our desire to be here, but in many cases, dealing with people who are here illegally.
As a practical matter, though, we need to make the distinction of the legal immigrant who's come here and obeyed all of our laws is an exemplary citizen. You'll find that they commit far fewer crimes per capita than American citizens do. These are the folks who have obeyed all of our laws. The Democrats love to compare them and confuse them with illegal immigrants whose very first act entering this country is a misdemeanor, of federal crime. And so it shouldn't surprise us that as a practical matter, these laws will apply overwhelmingly to those illegally in this country who have already demonstrated a disdain and disrespect for our laws.
But to put a finer point on it for the people back home watching this, we're talking about individuals who have been given a status to be in the United States, who have then carried out some action that we believe would require either deportation, inadmissibility, whatever is in the particular statute that we're proposing, or in the lion's share of the numbers, we're talking about people who came here evading our laws, ignoring our laws to come here, whether it's across the Rio Grande or otherwise, overstaying your visas, right? You came here, violated our laws, overstayed your visas, whatever it is. And you have, in this one case, committed Social Security fraud. In another case, whether you're here with legal status or came here illegally, you're engaged in support or otherwise engaged with helping Hamas in this one particular instance. Or perhaps you have been convicted of DUIs and obviously engaging in high-speed chases with respect to the danger posed to Border Patrol and otherwise. So again, just for clarification, this is what we're talking about here. When the average, I'll finish this, then I'll leave it open for the question. When the average person that I represent, if I ask the average person that I represent in the 21st District of Texas, in Central Texas, do you think that any of the individuals, any one individual who came here in violation of our laws, whether they felt they had a reasonable claim to some coverage for asylum or some basis for parole or anything else, but they came here, most people in my district, I don't know how your people in your district feel, would say that individual should be removed immediately. That individual should not be present in the United States at all. But here we're talking about, at least for that class of individuals, we're talking about, again, consequences for Social Security frauds. In other words, we're layering on something on top of that which most average Americans would say we should be removing, deporting, not having them in the United States at all. And then we're coming in and saying on top of that, oh, by the way, I mean, if you commit Social Security fraud, you really shouldn't be here. I mean, I'm just trying to put in perspective kind of the absurdity of the spectrum on which we find ourselves.
Well,
I wonder if the gentleman might comment.
well, it's pretty simple, actually. These bills are applying to drunk drivers, ID thieves, Hamas operatives, exactly the same provisions that we already apply for visa overstays, violating of non-immigrant status or condition of entry, smuggling aliens, committing a marriage fraud, being a drug user or a drug addict, falsely claiming U.S. citizenship, engaging in espionage. We're simply applying the same provisions that apply to aliens who have violated those laws to drunk drivers, ID thieves, and terrorists. I don't think that's too much to ask, but the Democrats do, and that tells us a great deal about the attitudes of the parties on this issue.
So we've got 4 bills here, high-speed chases with respect to Border Patrol agents, protecting ourselves from DUIs, i.e. people who are committing acts of driving under influence or have committed such an act, engaging in Social Security fraud, a fairly significant problem for people if you take someone's identity and steal their hardworking contributions to Social Security, and then no benefits, i.e. you shouldn't be here if you're, I don't know, cavorting with terrorists like Hamas, who endanger the American people and endanger our friends in Israel. So that's the position that we're laying forward in these 4 measures. Is that correct? I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think the chairman, thank you, gentlemen, for appearing before the committee. And I want to address a couple of issues. I know, Chairman Green, you brought up your service. I just want to echo just one more time your fidelity to the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States, which were being questioned earlier, I think, inappropriately, based on your past service in the military, service here in the United States Congress. And I just want to ask if there's anything else you want to reiterate about your lifetime of service and commitment to the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States.
Thank you.
So thank you, sir. Let me just say a couple of points of observation. And I'd ask Chairman Green if you agree that what we're seeing at the southern border, what we're seeing happen due to open borders is unprecedented.
Yeah, there's nothing in our history that rivals the depth and breadth of the crisis at the southern border, where foreign agents, not of a government, but of the Mexican cartels, have seized control of the southern border, where, 150,000 dead Americans. I mean, we lost 54,000, I think it was, in Vietnam in a 10-year war. In 2 years, we've lost 150,000 people to fentanyl. The cartels have metastasized throughout our country. It's unprecedented. And I'll also say, in terms of the actions of the secretary, all the previous secretaries attempted to detain, and then when the resources were exsanguinated, they did what they had to do on a case-by-case basis in accordance with the law. I would love to make a correction to the record from earlier, if I could.
Please.
The Supreme Court did not rule on the lawlessness of the secretary, but lower courts did, and lower courts found him breaking the law, violating the laws, as it relates to his memorandum issued to ICE to tell them not to detain criminal felons, et cetera. What the Supreme Court did was rule on standing. They decided not to decide. But it's fascinating if you go to the oral arguments in that case, where even the Solicitor General, arguing on behalf of the Biden administration, says, and I paraphrase, my documents are here, but I'll just paraphrase it, essentially that the states don't have standing here. Congress is the one that handles these kinds of things. And Justice Kavanaugh actually says, I think your position, what you're saying is that Congress is the one. And I do have his quote here. Congress has to resort to shutting down the government or impeachment or dramatic steps. So she then replies, yes, with statutory regulatory violations, it's the Congress who holds. So that's what came out of the Texas versus the United States. States don't have standing. It's a blank check to Mayorkas as long as Congress doesn't act.
When faced with an executive branch that refuses to carry out the law, the options in front of Congress are what? It's the power of the purse.
We could defund, but then that gets us no border security.
It raises issues with respect to how you manage the funding issue. But the power of the purse is one tool.
That is correct.
The other tool is impeachment. And we'll come to that in a minute, right? Another tool is
Or
impeachment.
pass another law,
Or the third area is to pass another law, right? Now, true or false, under 212F currently, the President of the United States would have the emergency authority to shut down the border if he saw fit.
Yes, true.
Right, of course. And so when he declares this an emergency and he says he needs tools and so forth, he has the tools. He could stop it immediately, literally
Yes, that
under
is
existing law. Now, why do we need existing changes to existing law? Well, as we are trying to manage a system where we handle immigration, the current system is being exploited. I want to see if the gentleman agrees with this, where we have the general black letter law and spirit of the law that is security, right? Operational control of the border. You cannot come in without papers, right? Like that's the baseline. Then there's legal immigration. We'll invite you to come here. Here are some papers if you apply and you can get them and you're in the right line and the right standing. And then there's people who come here. And they come here and they try to claim something. True or false, this administration has been using asylum and parole as effectively a backdoor way to use those limited exceptions that are supposed to be predominantly case by case to use as effectively the exceptions that swallow the rule of security, right? That along with judge-made loopholes like Flores TVPRA with those complications. So those smaller provisions are being used to say, everybody come, make a claim, and get released. Is that a fair characterization in your observation?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what the lower court, that the Supreme Court chose not to overturn or make a decision on, exactly said that he had basically turned the whole immigration system upside down.
And the impact of that, right, just to see if these sounds correct to you, that of the sort of 3.3 million illegal aliens released into the United States since January of 21, the Biden administration failed to remove, through immigration court removal proceedings, roughly 99.7% of those illegal aliens. That compared to an average between FY17 and FY20 of 590,000 aliens encountered per fiscal year, we had over 1.4 million in 21, 2.3 million in 22, 2.4 million in 23. Impacts on cities and states. New York has spent $1.5 billion on the crisis. Texas has spent $12.5 billion on the crisis. Smuggling organizations estimate revenues increased from $500 million in 2018 to $13 billion in 2022. Immigration court backlog has increased from 1.3 million cases to 3 million cases. I could go on and on. The fentanyl numbers have gone from 4,800 pounds in fiscal year 20 to now we're in excess of, I think, 40,000 pounds or something in those rough estimates. And then the terror watch list, 11 total fiscal year 17 to 20, 331 total fiscal years 21 to 24 under Biden. So these are all concerning results, right, of open borders. Would the gentleman agree?
Absolutely.
And that's a fair characterization, plus more and stuff that you've got replete in all of the documentation of those numbers, and obviously they change on a monthly basis. I would ask, if I might, to introduce into the record 4 documents, because I've been working on this for a while, and to counter the point of the ranking member that this is somehow political. This is a response to President Trump. I mean, if the gentleman wants to give the president a call down to Mar-a-Lago and explain, what I was doing in Iowa the last month, I'd appreciate him doing that. But I would say that in October of 21, I laid out a case in long form, laying out the case for impeaching Mayorkas in a 13-page memo to my Texas Republican colleagues. In March of 22, about 5 months later, I updated that memo to the entirety of the GOP colleagues. In July of 23, I wrote an op-ed in National Review titled "The Constitutional Case for impeaching Mayorkas. And earlier this month, well, actually last month in January, I sent another memo updating the case for impeaching Mayorkas. Again, updating the numbers, keeping the general framework. I think the gentleman has seen some of that work. It's a result of work in Judiciary Committee. I'd ask all four of those to be entered in the record.
Without objection.
The reason I bring that up is because far from being political, this was October of 21, 10 months into this administration, where if you go look at that memo where we lay out the stark shift from January of 21 to October of 21, it was blatantly clear that the Secretary of Homeland Security was ignoring the laws, and that ignoring of the law was endangering the people I represent. That was the fact of the matter. Would the gentleman agree with that, and not just Texas, but also the people of Tennessee and other people around the union?
100%.
And along those lines, in the articles that have been presented, the Secretary has willfully and systematically refused to comply with the law. Notably, for example, you have in here INA 235B, INA 236C, and a host of other statutes in which the Secretary is required, right, to faithfully execute the laws. True?
That is correct, yes.
And at some point, then that is the question. And to the gentleman from Colorado who raised the questions about, well, you know, what is the mens rea and what are the elements of the crime? Where in the Constitution, if the gentleman, the learned doctor, you don't have to be a legal scholar to be able to read the Constitution, where in the Constitution of the United States is there anything that mentions elements of the crime or mens rea with respect to impeachment?
It's not there.
It's not there.
Right.
Now, why might that be? Because it's a political document, right? This is a political question. Now, it is a political question based on law, right? Based on our understanding of how we want to apply the laws. But where in the Constitution are high crimes and misdemeanors defined? Is there a definition section in the back?
No.
That defines high crimes and misdemeanors? So where might we go to determine high crimes and misdemeanors, right? History, experience, try to figure out what it means. Now, my friend from Colorado, which was here, because I referred to him in the third person, he's not here, but raised, as I believe a couple of other of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle raised, and actually a couple of colleagues on this side of the aisle have raised, the question about maladministration, which I do think is an important question. Whether or not high crimes and misdemeanors was meant to include maladministration, or whether maladministration was specifically rejected. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm certainly open to be corrected for the record, because I think this is an interesting history. I don't know that it would be dispositive either way. But it is my understanding that it was in fact not rejected by vote, but rather when it was suggested by Colonel Mason, and I think seconded by Mr. Gary, that then there was a point raised by Mr. Madison that I believe the gentleman from Colorado quoted, "So vague a term will be equivalent to a tenure during pleasure of the Senate," end quote. And then there was some one sentence debate here, and then Colonel Mason withdrew maladministration. It was not voted on. He withdrew maladministration and substitutes, quote, other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the point of that was that it was not, in fact, rejected, and it was not defined. Of course, that is a then question about whether or not maladministration, what was the concern about it? Some of these debates would go back during the 90s, during the Clinton debates, about whether you have to have done something in your official capacity versus your personal capacity, and all of that has been a significant debate. But I would note, and ask to insert into the record a law review article here from Duke University, without objection.
Without objection.
That in here, the author writes, a close reading of the Mason-Madison exchange discloses that it does not support either view in terms of the debate that they were having at the time. That first, the convention itself did not reject the term maladministration. Mason introduced the term and withdrew it after hearing Madison's objection. Because there was no vote, there was no opportunity for the delegates to adopt or reject Madison's concern. Second, according to Blackstone, British common law had developed a definition of high crimes and misdemeanors that included, but was not limited to, maladministration. The phrase also encompassed unofficial misconduct, etc., and it goes on. While Madison may not have known this, Mason apparently knew at least that it encompassed maladministration. Now, I'm not suggesting that I know exactly what they meant. I was not there. I am not suggesting that I think that it should or should not be a broad application of maladministration. That is a debate. But the simple truth is, it's up to us. So the question before us, I think, is one more of whether we open a door, we open a Pandora's box, right? That's the question that we would wrestle with here. The question here is whether the Secretary of Homeland Security has engaged in such conduct by ignoring the laws of the United States that you could reasonably suggest that he is violating his oath, right, to faithfully execute the laws of the United States, right? And on behalf of the president, for whom there is in fact phrasing in the Constitution that he must take care, right? And this, I think, is the center point of this entire debate. No one wants to have to go down the road of impeaching a secretary appointed and then confirmed by the Senate of the United States. I certainly don't want to do that. I assume the gentleman from Tennessee doesn't want to do that. Is that correct?
No.
Probably
it's
one of the
correct.
last
I
things
don't.
you want to do, right?
Exactly.
And so people say, well, this is a big political, scalp. Look, I mean, I tweeted out today, not shockingly, contra some of the interests of my Republican colleagues, that I might find it interesting that some of my colleagues would very much appreciate being able to say they impeached Mayorkas, but not actually get funding removed and have a spending fight in order to stop what's happening at the border. I have no interest in doing that, and most of my colleagues have no interest in doing that. It's a question. It's an academic question. We're here, as you said at the beginning, about whether or not, in fact, I think the question was raised by the ranking member about something about a date, right? April of last year, and that you set out to do this and had some sort of mission to do this. And then there's some questions about whether or not, with respect to Mayorkas, about whether or not the fact that it might fail in the Senate or some other political questions. And your response, I think, was exactly right. I want to ask you to elaborate on it if you want, that we have a duty to do it. If we believe that there is, in fact, a public official who has a duty under law and under the Constitution to enforce it, we have a duty to call that secretary out, force him or her to the table, and then, in the absence of a response to the elected representatives of the people, take action. And you're either defunding or you're impeaching. And you're impeaching under whatever you believe the understanding is under the law on high crimes and misdemeanors. I believe that a violation of the oath, that rises to that level. For example, if the Attorney General of the United States were to order all of the Department of Justice, United States attorneys, stop prosecuting crimes. Just sit back, let everything run amok. Now, there might be a statute that violates. I'm not sure. I'd have to go comb through the statutes and say that. But that would be a gross violation of that individual's duty under the Constitution. And if the president wasn't asking for his or her resignation, do you not agree that it would be incumbent upon us to say, you can't do that?
If I could interject,
Sure.
though, the laws don't direct him to do it, right? There's no law that tells the DOJ you must go and capture every single murderer, but the law written by this body is very clear. You shall detain. And for criminal aliens, criminal felons, it's you shall detain all of them. And then there are directions to ICE about immediate deportation once it's determined they don't have an asylum claim that's legit. This secretary has not detained. In fact, has done everything he can to not detain and has not deported. The numbers are all plummeting. I mean, they're building systems and mechanisms to do just what the law.
Does his own admission of 85 to 90%, which he is on record in terms of people acknowledging that he said it in front of people that works for him in Texas, 85 to 90% of the people being released into the United States, does that comport at all with any understanding of how we're supposed to assess credible fear and make determinations before releasing the United States versus the law requiring detention?
Not at all, because he's created these alternative pathways that don't exist in law, that actually subvert the law's intent of a case-by-case basis to get to parole.
Does the gentleman, in addition to the secretary violating his oath, his duty to enforce the laws of the United States, is the gentleman aware of a instance in which the secretary lied or misrepresented the facts under oath before committees, before this body?
Yes, I am very aware of multiple statements by Secretary Mayorkas where he said, by the definition of operational control, that he and the department had operational control of the southern border. There are multiple episodes of that, and other instances where he said the border's been secure when clearly it's not secure. So, yeah.
Now, the response to that, as you would expect, right, from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I would suggest maybe if it was in reverse, the response, if our side was trying to defend the secretary, is, well, those are vague terms, right? That, well, you know, when the secretary comes and he makes assertions about how he's carrying out his job and his perspective of it and that sort of notion of administration or maladministration. But I wonder if the gentleman might respond to the exchange that I had with the secretary, in which in April 19th, 2022 hearing in Judiciary Committee, I read word for word on a poster in the Judiciary Committee the statutory definition of operational control under the Secure Fence Act of 2006. Gentlemen, you're aware of that exchange, correct?
Yes, I am.
And I asked the secretary, quote, do you stand by your testimony that we have operational control in light of this definition? Now, I would just add here, I had already asked the question to set it up. He said we have operational control. I pulled up the chart, put the actual definition of operational control under the Secure Fence Act of 2006, and he replied, quote, I do. And Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and 2019, end quote. Now, in a side note, as a conversation with Chad Wolf, the former secretary who appeared before the committee, I asked him that question. And he said, I very expressly never said such a thing. What I said was, we are making great progress to achieve what is trying to be accomplished under the Secure Fence Act to try to achieve that number. And for the record, they were doing that. They were trying to figure out how to enforce the law to drive those numbers down in accordance with the operational control definition. My point of bringing that up is because in March 28th of 2023, not quite a year later, Senate Judiciary Committee, in response to a question by Ranking Member Lindsey Graham on whether we have operational control of the border, the Secretary said, quote, with respect to the definition of operational control, I do not use the definition that appears in the Secure Fence Act, end quote. The Secretary's playing games, and he's playing games very specifically with those definitions so that he can give the appearance to the American people that the border is secure, because most people aren't following it like we are. Most people are just going about their daily life. They're taking their kids to games, they're going to their job, they're, paying the bills, they're going and getting the groceries. They don't follow all this stuff, but they see masses of people at the border and they wonder what the hell's going on. So then you go tell them, well, the President of the United States is just making unilateral decisions to let lots of people come into our country, which, by the way, is undermining our national security, undermining our security. And they say, well, that's crazy. Who would do that? Why would they do that? They're the president. They're the secretary. They're supposed to enforce the law. And then you come back and say, well, by the way, I had the secretary in front of me. That's my job. I asked him a question. I was very specific. I gave him lots of room. I said, well, surely, if you look at this definition, you can't tell me you have operational control, Mr. Secretary. And he very boldly claimed that he did. And that is the problem, right? It is a snowing of the American people. There's further engagement with this that I won't belabor here because for time's sake, in which there's been abundance of, well, and this actually is important because in July of this last year, in the House Judiciary Committee, I questioned the Secretary again. After laying out the timeline of his previous statements, I asked, you looked straight in the American people, straight at me, straight at every person in this committee and said, we have operational control. Why? He said, you did not let me complete my answer. The Secure Fence Act defines operational control as not a single individual crosses the border. To which I said, I'm aware. I read it, and I read it to you, and you read it, and in fact, you said, I do. You didn't hesitate. You didn't say I do. I need to explain what I mean by I do. You said I do over and over again. Any comments on that and what that gives in terms of your belief that the Secretary should be impeached?
Well, we clearly believe that a breach of trust of both Congress and the American people is fairly articulated in the Founding Fathers' description of high crimes and misdemeanors. We've actually had testimony from the minority witnesses in our committee that said breach of trust is a high crime and misdemeanor. I genuinely believe that when you lie to the American people, when you lie to the Congress under oath, that is a breach of trust. If you look at the impeachment articles that were drafted against Richard Nixon, they very clearly don't name him for committing any crime, but they do say for giving false testimony and for making false statements. So that was an article then. Clearly it's precedent, and that this secretary has lied to the American people on multiple occasions. The horsewhipping incident. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, last
and
point.
Congress under oath, too.
Last point I'll raise is that one. the Secretary knew full well prior to issuing the statement about the alleged whipping incident in which lifelong public servants, Border Patrol agents, were being accused of the most vile and vicious, hateful, race-based kind of behavior. He, in fact, was made aware prior to the press conference
That is
that
correct.
this was, in fact, not true. Is that true?
That is correct. He knew before he went out to the press conference, and then he lambasted those gentlemen.
And is that lying and mischaracterizing of the faithful public servants of DHS and Border Patrol agents? Is that a violation of the public trust to drum up that kind of hatred?
Absolutely. It was clearly political.
The Secretary has, on numerous times, undermined border security, terminated border wall contracts. He sued Texas most recently, multiple times, frankly, and recently for trying to implement border security measures, and issued a memorandum that said the fact the individual is a removable alien should not be the sole basis of an enforcement action, which is basically rewriting the law by memorandum. I could go on and on. I think the main point here is, and I appreciate the chairman, I just want to push back on this notion that somehow this is, at least when I speak for myself, and I think for you, and I'll let you speak for yourself, that this is politically motivated. At the end of the day, I'll tell you this right now. If Secretary Mayorkas would call me up right now and say, you know what, I apologize for what I did to those migrants, those Haitian migrants. I should have been more careful in my definition with what I said to you in committee about what operational control is. We're going to fix this. We're going to go work with Texas. We're going to enforce the law. We're going to start detaining people. We're going to tell the world that we will detain you, legitimately, fully detain you. Otherwise, you're not coming in, because that's what our law contemplates. And we're going to do that, and we're going to send a message to the world so that cartels aren't empowered and people aren't going through this Darien Gap, traveling all the way up through Mexico with rape trees and people getting abused, and all the way through riding on the top of train cars, all the stuff that we're causing, and causing this to happen to Americans and to migrants in this false name of compassion. The Secretary would call me up and say, hey, let's get busy. You're right. Let's enforce the law. I had no interest in having a scalp with respect to the Secretary of Homeland Security. What I really want is to make sure that we're doing our job. Does the gentleman agree?
Absolutely. For me, that little baby crawling around on a VRBO that stumbled into fentanyl that had been left by the previous renter of the VRBO and died tells me that every American is unsafe with this open border. And I am passionately here because I believe it's the right thing to do.
Yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for whatever question she has for the panel.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back to the gentleman from Texas, recognized for questions.
I thank both gentlemen for being here and testifying. Just a few things. I know we're trying to move along in the interest of time. I would just, since we had the exchange with the gentleman from Kentucky, just stipulate for the record, I assume the gentleman from Texas, or from both gentlemen, agree in broad terms. The findings are laying out, first, that the United States and Israel are not parties to the Rome Statute or members of the ICC. And so, therefore, that raises legitimacy or jurisdiction over the United States or Israel. That's one primary, I think, an important point. Lays out the extent to which the prosecutor, Mr. Khan, announced arrest warrant applications for the Prime Minister, which I don't believe is disputed. And applications, to be clear, because some people get that wrong in the press, but for the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, Mr. Gallant, and does say that those should be condemned. I think, which I certainly agree with respect to condemnation. I believe there's bipartisan agreement on that in broad terms. And then there's a couple of other things in here which people can see, and the ICC's actions against Israel are illegitimate and baseless. Which, again, consistent with the point here about the ICC itself, which I would argue is consistent with what the gentleman from Kentucky was saying, but I'll let him judge that for himself. But just for clarifying, since we had a discussion about it, I wanted to make sure people understood why those findings existed. I would ask the gentleman, Mr. Crow, respectfully, having served, do you believe that the ICC should be able to go after an American serviceman?
I do not.
Good. On that, we have agreement. Do you believe that the ICC should be able to go after one of our allies?
Depends on the allies and the circumstances. Every individual circumstance is different. I'm assuming you're talking about this instance of Israel. I do have concerns of jurisdictional issues, and those are concerns that I think are worth debating. So the question is not, in my view, the concerns about jurisdictional issues, which have multiple components, right? There's the component of whether or not you're a party, but then there's also the implication that the ICC has made here, the assumption that the ICC has made here that the West Bank and Gaza are basically a state actor, part of a Palestine, which of course is something that should be debated as well. Those are debates that are worth having. The issue is, what is the remedy? And the remedy should not be, in this instance, sanctions, because I think that the blowback and the risk to the United States of this approach are severe.
Appreciate that. I mean, I'd ask my colleague from Texas about the importance of sanctions here. I mean, I think we've had some discussion here about the precedent setting, and the gentleman from Texas discussed the precedent setting, and the extent to which we allow the ICC, which we do not, the jurisdictional question has been discussed here, which we're not a party to, that you have a court out there that could be turned on, and it's not without precedent, that they try to come after and target American service members. And when the ICC takes this kind of a step, which has been condemned pretty roundly by members of both sides of the aisle, executive branch and legislative, and this is now I'm going to assert my position on it, that is deserving of significant rebuke, and that without something with teeth, that you're not going to limit the extent to which the ICC feels empowered and permitted to engage in this sort of activity in the future, including directed towards our own service members or our own Americans engaged in this kind of activity. And so I would ask the gentleman from Texas if he agrees with that and underscores the importance of timing, that stopping this before it moves very far down the track is critically important because of the unbelievably egregious nature of the ICC announcing the intent to issue warrants against the Prime Minister of Israel. I mean, I just want to say that out loud, and the Defense Minister of Israel, and that merits the strongest possible rebuke by the United States, and therefore setting up a construct, which this is designed to do, not haphazardly, but in direct consultation and working, by the way, across the aisle. Not that we reached agreement on every point, as is evidenced here in the debate, but reaching the ability to use a model, in this case, CATSA. I mean, we took an existing framework that had been passed on a bipartisan basis, applied that framework, and that is literally the basis of the construct for how the president could grant some waiver by coming to Congress and presenting it on a case-by-case basis. We tried to use that existing model. But I think at the end of the day, it's just a question of sanctions or no sanctions. I mean, we can debate some of the specifics. And like the gentleman raises points about the extent to which the language allows its extension to countries that are supporting the ICC, allies are supporting the ICC, and family members. The purpose of it was to, in fact, put teeth into it. It was to say that if you're a judge and you are targeting Americans, or you're targeting our friend, the Prime Minister of Israel, yeah, maybe you're a kid who wants to roll over here and go to Harvard. Maybe that kid shouldn't be able to do that. I think these were questions that I think we thought through and thought were important to address. One of the gentlemen from Texas would have thoughts on that matter, and then I'll allow the
It's vitally
Mr. Crow.
important we kill the snake while it's young in the nest.
Yeah.
That's the analogy. And that's, I believe we talked a lot about alliances here. I believe that our Western European allies, when they realized they could be next, they might join us. And frankly, there is a national security waiver in this bill, if I remember right, Mr. Roy. So we can actually have waivers for this bill should it be in the national interest of the United States. So absolutely, you were exactly right, because I've heard several comments here about undermining our alliances, damaging our reputation in the world. Folks, I don't know how much our reputation in the world can get any lower. There's an old saying about whales in the ocean, but you know, we've got to do something to reestablish our reputation in the world. And I yield back.
I assume the gentleman both, and I'll let the gentleman respond. Mr. Crowe, did you want to respond or
Sure, I just
wanna give you time.
I vehemently disagree with this notion that our reputation worldwide is couldn't be lower. So what does it matter? I think our reputation matters a lot. I think our reputation is very strong. We certainly have issues like every country that we need to address. But as I said in my opening, this is not a race to the bottom, nor should it be. And you know, we work with the ICC all of the time when it's in our vital national interests, right? So if we're going to be about rules of law, if we're going to be about consistency, if we're going to be about supporting international institutions, then you know, the thing about rule of law is you either support it all the time or you don't. You can't support it some of the time, or you can only support it when you agree with it. And why I raised that last point is because, and I raised this also in my opening, you all supported the Ukraine War Crimes Deterrence and Accountability Act, right? Which supports the ICC investigations against Russia, when Russia is not a party. So, you know, to stand here now and say, you know, the jurisdictional issue is the predominant one doesn't really fit with the history there. Then the last thing I'll say is the facts of specific instances are really important, because one of the primary things to look at when you look at whether any tribunal is appropriate for a given instance is the issue of whether or not there is an internal domestic legal process that can actually handle the issue within a country, right? And that's one of the reasons why we've all supported prosecutions and actions against Russia, because of course there is no viable internal process there. So we have to look at every individual circumstance on its own merits.
Mr. Roy, if I could respond to the Ukraine comment. Did not Ukraine authorize action inside Ukraine?
Well, in my recollection of that bill is that it did not specifically mention the ICC. I understand the gentleman's point, but I think it's what's important here is the threshold question, and the gentleman responded to it honestly, and I appreciate that when posed with the question whether the ICC, if it went after our own service members, the gentleman said he would not support that, nor would I, nor do I think any of us should. And I think the question here is whether, when we have a close ally and you have the ICC and you're empowering the ICC, right? If you kind of sit back and allow the ICC to engage in that activity against a non-party state, our ally, engaged in defense, then what precedent does that set, right? What precedent does that set to have an international tribunal to which we're not a party, to which our allies are not a party, having a judge issue warrants against the prime minister of somebody that we're relying on to help defend us in the Middle East, in theater, engage in active conflict, dealing with the fact that they have their own individuals who were targeted and killed. October 7th, of the most horrific crimes possible, dealing with the constant affront of thousands of missiles being shot at them from Hamas. And we can debate, and I'll take the gentleman at his word about the relative ratio, rate of casualties and with respect to civilians in Gaza. I've certainly seen reports that would suggest that the numbers are actually fairly impressive in terms of what they've been trying to do to target and avoid hitting civilians while still trying to carry out the activity of taking out Hamas. And I think here the question is whether the United States of America stands alongside Israel in trying to stop Hamas from continuing to do what they're doing, which is targeting Israel, to eradicate Israel, undermine Israel, our ally, our stated ally. And that, I think, is what is right before us right now. And when we have the extent to which the ICC effectively broke its own rules under the Rome Statute of the ICC by permitting the recognition of the state of Palestine, when in fact it's only countries can be part of the ICC. Understanding the debate that's ongoing about that, these are the issues that I think are significant and at play. I would also note that former President Trump, when he engaged in, and not to politicize it in that way, but we're bringing up the issues that are important, that the sanctions against the ICC worked, right? And that the United States taking positions like that matter. And this is what it boils down to. Bottom line here is we have a significant number of our Democratic colleagues who recognize what the ICC did here was horrific and needs actual teeth in response. We hope and believe that those Democratic colleagues will join with us in saying the United States should speak with a consistent, loud voice and sanction the ICC for what they're doing to our ally Israel. And unfortunately, the White House seems unwilling to want to take that step for political reasons, whatever reasons we want to ascribe to the White House. And I'll only say that I had a significant, I'm not going to talk about private conversations, but I had a large number of conversations with Democrat colleagues across the leadership spectrum and rank and file about this bill and this issue. And there's a lot of interest in wanting to work on it. A lot of it, and working on this construct, a construct that is not plucked out of thin air, isn't just made up, is modeled after existing statutes that we have agreed to. Literally take the statute right out of it and boom, put it in here and apply it. I think this is a simple question, and I think that's what's being laid bare here. Should we sanction the ICC or not? I think that is the question that is before us.
Mr. Can I comment
I'll
on that?
give you time, but I know we got
there's
votes.
a question. I think there's a question of the underlying concerns, of which there is broad bipartisan concern about certain elements of this case versus what's the appropriate remedy.
Fair.
And the White House did come out and release a statement of administration policy just a couple of hours ago,
Saw it.
where they said they're willing to work with Congress to figure out the appropriate remedy. So people are coming to the table and they're saying, all right, we have concerns. We have bipartisan concern about this. Let's figure this out. But the remedy can't possibly be we're going to put ourselves into a position of sanctioning 36 of our NATO and major non-NATO allies, sanctioning children of officials of the ICC, and also directly undermining all of the cooperation that is in our interests that the ICC is doing, that we are assisting in because it serves our national security interests. That couldn't possibly be the remedy, and that's my point. I think there's a lot of people who are willing to step up to the plate and say, you know what, let's take a step back. Let's go through the process. Let's have a hearing. Let's think about the secondary and the tertiary and the unintended consequences of this. Let's take a breath and figure out a path that doesn't jeopardize our own national security and our own interests in the manner in which this bill, because of the way it's drafted, does.
Mr. Self, do you want to speak to that? And
I
one more
would
thing,
just
and I'll
say,
turn back.
Mr. Roy, I appreciate your leadership getting movement on this, because I think he's right. There's movement, and I appreciate this bill doing that. Thank you.
I appreciate it, gentleman from Texas. I would just note that since the ICC's founding, which has now been over 20 years ago, every United States administration, both sides of the aisle, both parties, have refused to join the court, recognizing the concerns with its politicization and misuse. We are seeing a direct misuse directly right in front of us. As this Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, said, quote, we maintain our longstanding objection to the court's efforts to assert jurisdiction over personnel of non-state parties such as the United States and Israel. We're seeing them engage in it as we speak. It is incumbent upon Congress to act, particularly when the White House refuses to. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Thank the chairman. I thank all y'all for being here and testifying. And I'll try to be brief. He's covered these things. With respect to the CDBC issue, with respect to a central digital bank currency, if I'm correct, right? Was it in March? What year is this? 24. In March of 22, like 2 years ago, President Biden signed an executive order, right, exploring the pros, cons, benefits, the path forward, or whatever on such a concept, right? So it's not without concern that this is something that's right in front of us as a nation, right? I would assume this is should be one of the less partisan things that we should be putting forward. That regardless of one's ideology or political bent, that the concept of any government being able to insert itself into the currency that is being used to carry out free enterprise between an American citizen and another American citizen engaging in commerce, and therefore then use the power of government to influence the choices in commerce beyond what we already do with respect to tax policy, with respect to other levers of governmental power, that is the genesis behind what we're trying to do here with prohibition. Mr. Hill, would you be able to expand on that a little bit? I know you said so in your opening statement, but I think it's really critical for people to understand. People always get, they always like try to kind of mock or laugh at the slippery slope arguments, and I've yet to have seen a slippery slope argument made over the last 20 years that hasn't roughly been correct for the most part. And so I would just suggest that if we go down the road of CDBC, that this government would be able to insert itself into policy choices on right and left, right? This money cannot be used for an abortion. This money cannot be used for a purchase of a gun. This money can be used only for charging a car versus buying gas, or this money can be used. Pick your ideological spectrum. It's happened in real time in other governments around the country, notably in China. I just wonder, again, if the gentleman from Arkansas would expand on that a little bit, because I think it's central to some of the concerns Americans have.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I don't share his affection for A&M baseball and the defeat of the Razorbacks over the weekend.
Two out of three? It is.
But I do share his concern over this particular notion, and I think that I make the following points. One, the ambiguity that somehow a central bank in our government could issue what we think is a retail central bank digital currency, which is where our citizens, our businesses would have accounts at the Fed and transact activity in the central bank digital currency, that could be done without a strict authorization oversight by Congress. That's point one where I agree with you. I think there's bipartisan opposition to that. And we've had bills on the floor. In fact, I've co-sponsored a bill with the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, in opposition to it, because under Article 1, it's quite clear that we are responsible for the money coinage and that we've delegated that to the Treasury, and the Treasury has got the Federal Reserve in a distribution fiscal agent status. Number two, I think people should be concerned about the potential of abuse in a situation like that for their privacy and their transactions. And why would they feel that way? I think because of the pattern and practice that they've seen over just the time I've served in Congress. Operation Choke Point, just to name one. So I think we want to make sure that we err on caution by prohibiting this and by saying again, reiterating, it can't be done without authorization of the Congress. Third and final point. In my judgment, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Jay Powell, agrees with that. But guess what? The comments have been ambiguous at the Fed and in the administration. And so I think it's important that Article 1, branch of the government, speak clearly here, and that's why I'm in favor of this bill, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
I will in 1 second, if I can follow up and then open it up to the gentlelady. Unlike current dollars in circulation, now obviously we use credit cards, obviously we use Venmo, and let me just say that on Venmo, right? Are there not current efforts by the IRS to say transactions over a certain dollar amount, like $600, and Venmo should have greater scrutiny and greater, reporting and potential regulation? Is that not something that is happening in real time? And then I'll add to that, you can answer that, unlike currency, to the extent we still use currency, that this has a digital tether, right? I mean, there is a connection, a connectivity in terms of what you're talking about in the currency. So putting aside the extent to which we've gone, heavily digital with respect to credit cards, you've got a one-to-one relationship with your credit card company and the systems in place, which of course are regulated. Here, when you go straight up to a currency with that kind of a tether, that there is really, to a significant extent, no real limit other than us on what the government can then do with that, whether it's freezing or seizing assets, with respect to, as I was mentioning before, programming spending. And, I might just say, like, when we talk about these items, you brought up Operation Choke Point. I would also say we saw a lot of these questions, again, without raising the issues of debates that unfortunately got somewhat partisan, but I think we had some agreement and disagreement during COVID. Well, the extent to which government power was being used to then effectuate what citizens could or could not do would not such a currency give significant and greater power for the government to do that, regardless of the merits? Whatever one thinks about masks and, vaccines, mandates, whether you can leave 6 feet circles, whatever the hell you want to go down the line of talking about COVID, wouldn't such a mechanism provide a significant amount more power to the government to be able to effectuate the policies that were trying to be carried out during COVID? Would the gentleman expand on those couple of questions? And then I'll turn it to the gentlelady.
Implemented at a retail level with direct accounts, it absolutely would. And I think people have a right, as I said, to be concerned about their privacy. That would be the ultimately non-private activity. And I'll give you one other more contemporary example rather than choke point, and that's a debate we've had in the House Financial Services Committee for several Congresses, but intensely last week when we supported a bill by Barry Loudermilk of Georgia on something called the Consolidated Audit Trail that collects everybody's stock trades every day in every brokerage account and are not protecting PII, the personal information associated with that. And that would allow someone to mix that with open source data and triangulate in another database for a hack that makes TikTok look benign. And so this risk is on the top of minds, I think, of the American people. And that's, again, why I think implemented as you describe it, yes, it should be of serious concern to our families for their privacy rights. And I think they have had examples recently, in our recent past, that would indicate the government's a terrible privacy protector. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
The gentlelady had wanted to make a comment.
Yes, thank you so very much. Currently, the Federal Reserve is engaged in a pilot project that looks at how distributed ledger technology can be used to improve efficiency of cross-border payments and settlements involving multiple currency. This is occurring in coordination with other G7 countries, which are also engaged in similar projects to speed up and lower the cost of doing business around the world. Furthermore, all G20 countries are doing the same. In making the United States the only country on the planet to ban a CBDC is just unthinkable. But let me repeat that the only country to prohibit a CBDC would be what Representative Emmer's isolationist bill would do in stopping this testing in its tracks. It would undercut America's commitment to its allies and seriously impair our ability to influence the standards adopted by other nations as we forge ahead with CBDC. All I'm saying is this, if I may, and that is, we don't want to be seen as a country that's not futuristic enough to at least look at it, to explore it, to test, to find out. Right now, we're the only country that is proposing, any of our members proposing a ban. All I'm saying is, let's not stop what the Fed is doing in trying to do the research.
So look, I appreciate the exchange with the gentlelady.
Yes.
I would make two comments. One, the idea that America being alone in choosing a path is probably, in my mind, a indication that that path might be a good one. That's just a personal observation about the tendencies of our of other countries around the world. And I kind of like it when America's thinking independently and trying to think about figuring out how we're going to preserve liberty and make sure that we don't have government control of currency. And I would note, and I say this as a positive, the gentlelady was on the floor when we were having a significant amount of debate and a hotly contested vote that I think I might have disagreed with some of my Republican colleagues on the panel about warrants as it related to FISA. And I would note a overall philosophy for me that I shared. The gentlelady made a comment on the floor saying, you said I'm old enough to remember, respectfully, I'm quoting you, old enough to remember J. Edgar Hoover. And you made the point on the floor about the extent to which the empowerment of government is concerning. And I would just note in this instance, where I might have some disagreements with my colleagues on this side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on that particular vote, you and I were aligned on that vote, I would just posit here for consideration that what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do, is to Congress speak up and say, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to go empower government to be able to control a currency at the level that we believe can be foisted on the American people this way. And that does not foreclose continued debate, investigation, discussion about where that would go. We have plenty of committee hearings. We can have plenty of consideration. Fed can research whatever the hell it wants to research, but we could have a debate about this. But my only point is, I believe it is critically important that Congress speak to say that the power of government should not be used to allow government to be inserted between our use of currency and engaging in free enterprise. But with that, in the interest of time, I will yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico for questions.
Thank you so very much. And it strikes me.
Texas recognized for any questions he may have.
First, let me just say I would associate myself to remarks of the gentleman from Kentucky and South Carolina about my appreciation for what you, Mr. Lawler, have been doing and trying to promote what I think is most obviously to anyone viewing a sincere belief and effort to represent your constituents here, which is what we're supposed to do in our Republican form of government, and fight for them and what they're telling you that they care about and what you see that they care about. I think, as the gentleman knows, I've been working as much as I know how to work in recent days and over the recent months to try to figure out how to answer this particular question for you and for some other colleagues. And I'll admit here in front of God and this panel and everybody watching that I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted because I want you to get the vote. I don't believe this is how we should be doing it. I believe, like the gentleman from Kentucky, that we should have had a more open rule on the tax bill that we voted on last night. I believe we should have had amendments and had the ability to let this play out and let people figure out where we were going to end up on some of these. I don't think we've had as many what you might call open or at least structured rules, quasi-open, whatever you want to call it, as we should, this Congress. I do believe that we had moved a good number of things in a good direction for a while in terms of, we had 1,100 votes on amendments. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would say that they didn't get all the ones that they want, and I get that, and that's how this works when we go through the process. But could be better, could be worse. But yeah, I think, we had 10 appropriations bills get out of committees, 7 that got off the floor. I think some things were moving in the right direction, and unfortunately that came to a halt. And so now we're doing everything essentially by suspension of the rules. I mean, that's pretty much all we've done since, November 1, effectively. And so that's what we did last night. We passed a massive tax bill by suspension of the rules. By the way, on a very bipartisan basis. I mean, I do want to point out that more Democrats than Republicans voted last night for a bill that had massive tax advantages for corporations. That's just true. 180-something Democrats, 170-something Republicans voted for that bill. And I voted against it for reasons that are well publicized last night and on the floor and otherwise, about my concerns about the child tax credit, its expansion, its applicability to parents who are here illegally, who have children that were born here. And we can debate those policies, but the fact is we just did it on suspension. People say, well, why would you claim time in opposition to the bill? Well, because somebody should. Somebody should. What happens in this town is we do things like that, and you go down to the floor, and then there's 2 parties, and they bring it up together, and then they split the time, and then it's just share the time, and there's a kumbaya, and everybody does their 1-minute speech, and then they send it out to constituents. Which constituents? I don't know, the K Street constituents, and say, look, we got your expensing, we got your R&D, we got your interest deduction, and then the average hardworking American out there is going, what the hell did I get? That's the truth. And we didn't have an open process, we didn't have amendments, we didn't have the ability to make changes that we ought to do for the hardworking families out there. Meanwhile, I have to oppose the bill for the reasons I explained last night on the floor. So now here we are, and we've got to make a decision about this. And if we're going to have a debate about salt, then we ought to have a debate about salt in the context of all of the other issues. I think it's important to have this debate about the essentially marriage penalty, if you will, on this. It's real, and it does affect some what you would call middle-income earners, but it also affects people who are not middle-income earners. There's a cap on this one. I'm trying to process the cap. It's $500,000. I put it in the context. I have no idea. I haven't been able to study it. I haven't been able to look at it and see, well, what's the actual impact? How much of this is going to wealthy earners? How much of this is going to middle-income earners? I think our whole system is pretty corrupted, by the way, from top to bottom. As I said in the Budget Committee, my Democratic colleagues will sit there and say, you can't even mention the word Social Security and Medicare when we're talking about literally voting on a debt commission. You can't mention it. But on the other side of the aisle, you can't mention taxes, or I don't know, Grover Norquist is going to come after you with some sort of, hammer or something for violation of some pledge you took 12 years ago. And this is where we are in this town. And the point is, we ought to actually sit down and figure out what we're going to do. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I've said repeatedly in this room, these complaints about how the tax cuts of Bush, Trump, or any otherwise have somehow harmed our ability to have revenue is belied by the evidence of the highest revenue we've ever had, like upwards of 20% of GDP. Like just the math, the charts put out by the Federal Reserve belies the very accusation that somehow tax cuts are in and of themselves restrictive of revenue as opposed to potentially causing additional revenue because you're allowing people to create wealth. I might disagree with where some of those things are allocated. Maybe more should be for small businesses. Maybe more should be for different things. But have that debate. But don't sit there and just throw out these accusations that somehow having tax relief, including the ones yesterday that 188 or whatever the number was Democrats voted for, that the expensing issues, the R&D issues, that doesn't create economic growth. Can we at least acknowledge that a bunch of my Democratic colleagues believe that? They do. They're on the floor saying so. They're out talking about it. It's true. So let's just stop the that means this is all stuff that's just to benefit corporations. Look, I'm not sure here the right approach. I do not believe this is regular order in any way, shape, or form, because I literally have no idea the impact of this legislation as I sit here and look at it, because we didn't do it through regular order, didn't go through a committee. I don't have the report sitting there saying this is what this bill will do. I don't have the CBO score. I don't have the time to look at it. To the extent it's a 72-hour rule, it's okay. It's only if we don't vote on this until next week, but we didn't get the benefit of that here in the rule, debating the rule in the Rules Committee. And I just think that's a problem. I think this is not the way we should be doing things. And I don't think the vote last night is the way we should be doing things. And I think there are so many areas here where we could actually have bipartisan or at least multiple forces within the conference, despite our violent disagreements on a lot of different things, be able to come together on some of these issues to make a good decision for the American people. Like, biggest applause line I get if I go out and talk to constituents at home is banning stock trading among members of Congress. And I get it out there, and that's Abigail and I have that bill, and others do, and it's like, well, are we ever going to have that conversation or debate? I don't know. Ask the Uniparty. I'm not sure. But there are ways here to try to find a path forward on some of the things we agree on. But jamming through this rule on, at 9:30 in the morning on Thursday on a flyout day is not how I prefer to do things. So I'm conflicted, not 100% sure what my vote will look like here or on the floor. I'm figuring that out based on what I'm listening to today. But I want to say for the record that, I've had Mr. Lawler has been 100% forthcoming with us, colleagues, like what he wants to accomplish. I applaud his efforts to do that. I'd like to see us have votes on these measures so that we can debate them. There are pieces, I do believe that, last point I'll make, this stuff, there's a reason a lot of people have been fleeing, and I think Mr. Lawler, you might agree, fleeing New York to jurisdictions like Florida or South Carolina or Texas. And one of those reasons is the high tax rates. Well, part of that, right, is once you remove the federal subsidization of those high rates, right, then that suddenly is hitting even harder. So people go, well, gosh, I'd really like to be in Florida with 0% income tax, or I'm going to be in Tennessee with 0% income tax or lower property taxes. Texas, we've got 0% income tax, but our property taxes are pretty daggum high. And so, this actually would hit home with some of my constituents, right? Some of my constituents who are in that kind of upper middle would say, I might get a little benefit out of this bill that you're suggesting. But I haven't been able to process that or analyze it and think about it on a macroeconomic scale across the nation. And that is what's bothersome to me. Again, we're supposed to go through this process so we can do that. So I applaud what you're trying to do. If I end up voting against the rule, it's not because of you, and it's not out of disrespect for anybody or it's just trying to make sure that we can try to fix this place. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman yields back to the gentleman from Texas. Rick.
Thank my friend from Texas. Mr. Duncan, a couple quick questions. My understanding is that based on the existing natural gas plays that we know that are in existence, we could increase gas production by about 50%, and LNG exports fourfold over the next decade. Does that sound right to you?
I think it's a little low, but yes.
Yeah, could be low, right? I think those are conservative estimates, as I understood them. There's 17 LNG projects awaiting export permits from the DOE. Does that sound right to you? That's the information I have in front of you. Natural gas production is currently at its peak under Biden. So it's not a good time to try to ratchet back on it, right? That's important for our current for economic strength, right, as for Americans. But here's the part that I really want to get at. Is this going to help or hurt our economy?
Hurt our economy.
Is this going to, meaning this being the Biden play, not the bill, right? So the Biden play, this bill is meant to undo.
This bill will undo it and help
Correct.
the economy if we're talking about the bill.
And would the Biden regulations restricting LNG exports help or hurt Ukraine?
This would hurt Ukraine.
Right. Is our position over the last number of years restricting and not opening up LNG production exports, could that have, in many ways, certainly pre-invasion 2 years ago, hastened and encouraged the invasion because we left our European allies, including Ukraine and everybody in Europe, more dependent on Russian gas?
The gentleman's correct. Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, were heavily reliant upon Vladimir Putin's oligarch for their energy resources. We could change that forever by exporting more U.S.-produced resources.
Does a moratorium on LNG exports help or hurt Russia?
If this stays in effect and the United States cannot export the natural gas that Eastern Europe needs, they're going to look to Russia, and it will help pad the pocket and fund the war of Vladimir Putin.
With respect to some of the stuff you talked about the rest of the world, right? Something in the zip code of half the world does not have reliable power, right? Something in the zip code. Certainly a third, 3 billion-ish or so people do not have access to reliable power. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds about right.
And so for the sake of the world and exports, right, exporting liquefied natural gas, encouraging the production and the building out of gas-fired plants, certainly improves the condition of people throughout the world and allows them to adapt to climate, frankly, better, right? Our climate-related deaths are actually at historic lows, right? Because we're able to manage and adapt to the climate based on abundant, reliable energy. Is that fair?
That's fair to say.
And by restricting the availability of reliable energy, we're making people more subject to climate problems, right? Because they're not able to have the energy necessary to deal with any issues that are thrown at them climate-wise. So the hurricane that wiped out Galveston in, whatever that was, 1900, right? We now have the ability to deal with those issues in greater strength, get power back up and running. I mean, Governor DeSantis had power up and running within 72 hours in most places in 90% of the areas in Florida because we have a stronger, more resilient, more reliable grid. Is that fair?
That's fair to say, and I would just add that you're keeping people in energy poverty around the globe without allowing them, not just from the climatic events, but energy poverty, not being able to have the standard of living that they desire.
And was this state of affairs made worse last year with the passage of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and the numerous subsidies in it that went predominantly, 90% of which, to billion-dollar type corporations, and much of which goes to China, much of those subsidies? Would you agree with that as a general matter?
I agree with that.
And in fact, was not the main purpose in many ways of the Inflation Reduction Act to try to drive, frankly, American natural gas out of power?
This administration has targeted American fossil fuel production from day one. President Biden said it on the campaign trail, and he's lived true to his campaign promises.
Well, a question for the ranking member, if you will. You had referenced the extent to which the White House, what it was doing, and the White House put out what they are saying on its decision, and they highlighted a bunch of statements. And one of the things you commented on was that we're not ending LNG, right? And the White House put out and advertised it and tried to trumpet their decision, what they are saying. A number of statements from Al Gore, who said world leaders agreed on a transition away from fossil fuels. The president's taking that pledge seriously. The president and CEO of Natural Resources Defense Council, let's be clear about the public interest. It's time to phase out fossil fuels. Putting all those aside, Sierra Club actually put out a statement literally that said, huge news, POTUS and Secretary Granholm have taken a bold and historic action to stop LNG. So the White House trumpeted that as a message, as a marketing tool for the success of their plan. And so how is that consistent with the idea that we're not actually trying to attack and end LNG, i.e. American natural gas, that is going around the world and lifting people out of poverty, making our industry stronger, making Russia weaker, making Ukraine stronger, all of those things that we get from exporting LNG? These groups say stop LNG. How is that consistent with the idea that we're not working to stop LNG?
Well, I haven't commented at all about the climate aspect of this because, frankly, I wasn't sure that you on the other side of the aisle were that concerned about that. I thought we were mainly concerned about price and, what we were going to do here. I mean, the problem, in my opinion, is that the administration's main focus here when we talk about the public interest, in my opinion, is to make sure that price does not go up for the American people. We know that there are occasions in the past where the price has increased dramatically, because of, when it's not available here and it's being exported abroad. We know the same thing is true about crude oil. The price went up significantly. Plus, in terms of all these other countries that you are so concerned about, the reality is that the main countries that use natural gas are the European countries, and the very EU Commission, said that this is not going to affect anything because there's going to be plenty of LNG available. In fact, it might be 3 times as much, even with the existing production and shipping overseas. So, I'm trying to focus on the fact that our allies aren't going to be hurt. Our adversaries like China are the ones that are mainly dependent on, and more dependent on LNG from the United States. I don't really care about China. As far as I'm concerned, you can suffocate their energy supply. I'm mainly concerned about the U.S. and the fact that if we don't have this public interest analysis that you want to get rid of, then these applications are going to be reviewed without knowing what the price is going to be for American consumers. We could talk about the environment if you want to, but this public interest analysis is, I think, primarily focused on not having the price go up for Americans. That's my concern.
Mr. Duncan, how does that compare to the point that we were making before, that there was upwards of 50% availability of gas production if we were to unleash American natural gas and not constrain it? In other words, do we believe the market is actually constrained or restricted, as was just alluded to or suggested, in terms of what that would mean for price? Or do we have the ability to robustly produce American natural gas, both for the benefit of the American people, if unleashed, as well as for exports, in order to facilitate and help allies and drive production of gas facilities around the world?
Well, it comes down to supply and demand, and we have a tremendous amount of supply here in the United States. We hear comments about price increases, but we led the world in energy production. We lifted the export ban on crude oil. We saw energy prices actually go down in this country post-2019. When energy prices started going up was when the Biden administration started restricting production, restricting future lease sales. This isn't an overnight phenomenon. You have to have planning. You have to have investment. You have to have development. You have to have production. You have to have production tied into pipelines. Those pipelines to deliver those resources, whether it's liquid oil to refineries or natural gas to LNG exports or to the utilities to utilize those. You have to produce, you have to deliver, you have to utilize, and then we can export. We have an abundance to export. And it will not affect prices by continuing the export. Democrats have said, we're not banning the existing export terminals that are out there. We're just wanting to ban future or pause future investment in that. Well, if we, and this is an indefinite pause, let's assume that this administration remains in power for another 4 years. That's delaying another 4 years of planning and investment and development and production and delivery. And so this was misguided press release by the administration, but it was intentional because the intention of this administration since before they moved into power was to stop and kill the U.S. fossil fuel industry, period.
Is the gentleman aware that the increased use of solar farms and large use of that has created a number of stalled projects in this country based on environmental impact and working through the environmental impact statements of said solar farms, as well as the fact that the windmill farms and the products that are produced them, the amount of energy that goes into the production of the actual windmills themselves, and then the actual destruction of those, that they're very difficult to recycle or to deal with. And in fact, we bury these large windmills, blades and so forth in many places and circumstances. Is the gentleman aware of those implications that we have for a massive shift in that direction away from, say, clean burning natural gas in terms of the impact on the environment?
We haven't even begun to fathom the environmental impact of some of these renewables, whether it's the batteries that go in EVs, into life of windmills, into life of solar panels, into life of EVs, and what that might do to the environment.
Last two questions. One is that the gentleman, I assume, is aware that coal has something like 1,100 coal-fired plants that they operate, and they're producing 2 a week. That accounts for about 30% of global emissions in terms of what they're producing. So to the extent that we can have liquefied natural gas being exported, to the extent that we can encourage China to use liquefied natural gas or nuclear, which they're building some of, that certainly would have a net positive impact on emissions, correct? If one is concerned about CO2. And the final point is that, does this sound right to you? I read a study in which EQT Corporation CEO Toby Rice pointed out that replacing coal power overseas around the world, so all of the coal-fired plants that are currently in operation in China, India, and other places around the world, that if we were to replace those with American LNG, putting aside nuclear and other options, would have the environmental impact of electrifying every vehicle in the United States, putting solar on every household in America, and adding 54,000 industrial-scale windmills, doubling the United States wind capacity combined. That's if we were to replace coal-fired plants around the world with liquefied natural gas exports. Now, obviously, we can't do that in one single fell swoop. Obviously, there's going to be other countries that are going to explore different options. But does the point remain that the production of American gas, is that a net benefit for overall environmental benefit as well as economic benefit for the American people? Would the gentleman agree?
Gentleman's correct.
So therefore, I would thank the gentleman for being here and for his support of this bill, and I yield back.
This recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Klein, this bill is named after Laken Riley, correct?
Correct.
Who tragically was killed about, 11 days ago?
Correct.
Student at Augusta University, right, I think, who was going for a jog 11 days ago. Now she's no longer here. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
She was killed by somebody who was released into the United States under mass parole under the Biden policies through El Paso. Is that what you understand?
That's my understanding.
Current law requires parole to be on a case-by-case basis. Is that what you understand?
That's what the law says.
And yet this administration is using parole to mass release people into the United States, resulting in the death of an American citizen, at least this one, Lake and Riley, in Georgia. Is that what you understand?
This is the most recent one, yes.
Could this bill also have been named, for example, after any number of other individuals, particularly, for example, the 2-year-old who was killed here in Montgomery County, Maryland, who was also killed by somebody who was released on mass parole from an individual from Venezuela?
It could have.
Or perhaps the individual who was raped in Louisiana, a minor who was raped in Louisiana by somebody who was released, a Honduran?
Yes, sir.
Or perhaps we could go back in time. How about Kayla Hamilton, a 20-year-old with autism in Aberdeen, Maryland, with her boyfriend, a 17-year-old illegal alien from El Salvador who appeared at the border in March 2022, an unaccompanied alien minor, and was released into the country to a sponsor. The suspect lived near Kayla, where he would later rape her and beat her to death in her home in July of 2022, less than 2 years ago. A young woman with autism. Authorities later found out that the assailant was a documented MS-13 gang member from El Salvador who was arrested in 2020 for associating with the gang. Does that seem to be a situation in which our border is secure? Is that somebody that maybe perhaps should not have been released into the United States?
Tragically, that's correct.
How about Aiden Clark in Ohio, a 10-year-old boy, 35-year-old illegal alien from Haiti who was released into the country, common theme here, in August of 2022, was struck when he struck a school bus full of children, resulting in the bus flipping and ejecting Aiden, killing him. It's a 10-year-old boy. Another result of the policies of this administration and their open border policies, but more importantly, their release policies of releasing individuals into the United States with spurious understanding of our ability to know whether they've committed crimes, and when we do, still releasing them often. Would the gentleman agree?
I would agree.
Or how about Elizabeth Medina, who was who was murdered by someone released under the Obama administration? A victim on December 5th, 2023. Elizabeth Medina, a 16-year-old high school student who was a part of the cheerleading team, was found dead in her bathtub in Edna, Texas, by her mother. Her mother found her 16-year-old daughter dead in a bathtub in their home. She was supposed to perform in a local Christmas parade with her cheer squad, but never showed up where her mother went looking for her. Can you imagine?
No, I can't.
The suspect, Rafael Romero, was charged with Elizabeth's murder, a 23-year-old illegal alien who was overstaying his visa for the past 5 years. Another person in the United States unlawfully, because of this administration's and the previous Democratic administration's failures to enforce the law. I could keep going. Example after example of individuals. 10-year-old boy killed in a hit-and-run incident in Midland, Texas, caused by an illegal alien that had been deported 5 separate times. I don't want to hear any more about Cato studies. I don't want to hear any more about, who commits more crimes or less crime, fewer crimes. What I want to hear about is whether someone is supposed to be in this country in the first place, and whether those individuals, when they're in this country, released into this country, particularly knowing that they've been committing crimes or affiliated with gangs or affiliated with dangerous criminal organizations, are released in the United States and then conduct crimes that kill Americans. Does the gentleman from Virginia agree?
I do agree, Mr. Chairman.
With respect to the Senate bill that we've heard so much about, is the gentleman from Virginia under the perception that the gentleman from Texas, myself, is somehow beholden to the former president of the United States, President Trump?
No.
Is there any indication in the news that he is beholden to the former president of the United States?
No, Mr. Chairman.
The reason I point that out is the bill that the former president opposed in the Senate is a bill worthy of opposition because the bill would not have done the job. And the former president is correct. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I assume the gentleman from Virginia would agree, but it's important for the record to reflect that that bill would not have accomplished the job, and in fact would have made it worse. And that is why it was opposed before it even came to the House. People want to say, well, somehow House conservatives who killed that bill. Well, I wish I had that magic wand because there's a lot of bills I'd like to kill by just blinking at it. But this bill was killed in the Senate. I'm not even sure, remember what the vote was? It wasn't very close. The bill died in the Senate. Now, why might it have died in the Senate? Here's the question I would have. Would this bill have fixed? Let's just focus on the issue of parole. Let's just focus on parole, not the rest of the bill, not the utter nonsense about this bill would have done something in terms of increased funding that we know would have been used to process more people or somehow would have dealt with fentanyl. The fact is parole. This bill would not have fixed parole, the Senate bill, because as I understand that bill, it would have simply continued to allow parole to be awarded en masse to people through ports of entry and included mass exceptions to what you could do to even that rule. In other words, it wouldn't have touched parole. So the very mechanism that has been used to parole these individuals, the very mechanism used to parole the man who came into this country, was released, went to New York, engaged in some behavior where he's engaging with police there, then left and went to Georgia, killed Laken Riley. It was under parole that the Senate bill would not have fixed. Is that the gentleman's understanding?
It's my understanding that the bill would have codified the misuse of parole authority that's currently the policy of this administration.
It is also the gentleman's understanding that it would have provided attorneys for people who are here illegally? Is it also the gentleman's understanding that that legislation would have codified mass releases in the form of what we casually refer to alternatives to detention?
That's my understanding.
Because what I think the average American probably is under the misunderstanding, if they listen to the words uttered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that somehow the Senate bill would have had this magic ability to fix the glitch that magically just started going on steroids somehow in January of 2021, just totally coincidentally. That we would have had, with respect to the entirety of all of the releases into this country, right? We know that asylum wouldn't have been fixed under the Senate bill. We know that parole wouldn't have been fixed under the Senate bill. We know that lawyers would have been provided. NGOs would have received upwards of, I don't know, $1.4 billion, $2 billion, $2.5 billion, something like that dollars for NGOs to continue to process people. $4 billion allegedly for asylum officers to process claims with a requirement they be processed in 180 days, which we know would have been a rubber stamp for asylum claims, when in fact the average American believes, as I started to say a minute ago, that people are detained. That if someone comes to this country, as the law says, you are to be detained. That a claim is then processed by somebody for a legitimate claim of persecution for your religious or political beliefs. It is detained, it is then determined, and then you are either returned home or allowed to be in the United States temporarily while we sort out your claim. Is that what the gentleman understands is what the current law should be and what most average Americans think it is? But the truth is, under the Biden administration, people are being released en masse into the United States under parole and asylum and other avenues.
That's my understanding.
So now we have the legislation before us, named after Laken, that would do two things. One, the second part, which has gone before committee, is a part that would give standing to states to be able to go into court and to say, hey, we have a situation where law's not being enforced and we're being harmed by it. Well, let me ask you a question. If you're the parent of Laken Riley, do you think there's a harm?
Absolutely.
If you're the attorney general or the governor of the state of Georgia, do you think there's been a harm to one of the citizens that you represent?
Absolutely.
And do you think in the absence of enforcement of the law by the federal government that it should be incumbent upon the governor and the attorney general of that state in Georgia to be able to go into court to say that the laws of the books, the federal laws, should be enforced?
Yes, sir.
The other provision is a provision to require that when there are certain crimes I don't have the list in front of me, theft, burglary, and other crimes, that those crimes that are currently largely being ignored or not reported, or if they're reported, there's not a detainer attached to it, this would require that a detainer be attached, correct?
Correct.
Now, again, for the complaint that I've heard about, well, it might just be an arrest, that's un-American, we're talking about people here who came to the United States and were released into the United States under color of a claim to asylum or under some expansive use of parole, released into the United States, i.e. you're a guest. You are a guest under the benefit of the privileges of being here in this country. And you get arrested. You get arrested. Now, there's due process under our Constitution for someone who's here, who's a non-American citizen. Due process in terms of the arrest and the crime. Do you have a right to not have a detainer placed on you when you came into the United States and you're seeking asylum or seeking a benefit when you come to the United States?
No.
You do not. All we're trying to do in this legislation, it ain't rocket science. It ain't a 1,000-page bill filled with, I don't know, $12.7 billion of earmarks. Sorry, I think I just slipped into another bill in another category of debate. It is a short bill designed to try to help the American people, try to give some sort of semblance of order to our country when the American people have had it, and had it with a Congress that refuses to do its job to check an executive which is lawless and out of control, and that Americans are dying as a result of it, namely Ms. Riley from Georgia. I yield back.
That is a gentleman from Texas.
I thank the chairman. I'll just ask Chairman McCall if in your recollection, when President Trump was president, were we involved in more war or less war? I would ask whether or not the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas occurred under President Trump's watch or under President Biden's watch.
I would say there were no wars in the prior administration. And I would also say, with respect to Ukraine, it was President Trump that delivered a $300 million lethal aid package for Ukraine that I signed off on. The first president to ever do so. Whereas the prior administration was giving them blankets, but not weapons. We had deterrence, I think.
Would the chairman agree that
at that time
that Ukraine was invaded by Russia under President Biden's watch, not President Trump's watch? That the Abraham Accords were carried out under President Trump's watch, not President Biden's watch? As I just noted, Hamas went into Israel conducting indescribable, horrific events on the people of Israel under President Biden's watch, not President Trump's watch. Is it not true that Nord Stream 2 set the stage for Russia going into Ukraine under President Biden's watch, not President Trump's watch? Is it not true that we abandoned Afghanistan, leaving Bagram, leaving Americans behind under President Biden's watch, not President Trump's watch? Are these not all true statements?
those are all absolutely correct, and it's not by coincidence. It's by design, because when our adversaries see weakness, you invite aggression, and that serves what we have right now.
Before I go on, I think that I would like to yield a minute or as much time as he needs to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I'd like to thank my friend from Texas. Yeah, just a few points in rebuttal. So as my friend from Texas was saying, if you look at the timeline, it tells you everything you need to know. The world is now on fire. It was under control in the last administration. But if you look at it, Nord Stream 2 is the best example. Somebody said that President Trump was aiding Russia. President Trump was shutting down Nord Stream 2. It was the Biden administration that greenlit Nord Stream 2. And again, I hate to reiterate this, but they did it at the same point where they shut down the Keystone XL pipeline for us. So when we can't export our own LNG, Russian gas is more expensive, by the way, which is much dirtier, the dirtiest gas there is. And at the same time, the Biden administration, to this day, is still fighting us on LNG exports. They're not allowing any permits for LNG exports, which, again, weakens our power on the international stage and strengthens who? Russia and Iran. There was some talk about allies across the world not trusting this administration. Why don't you go and ask Niger what they think about the Biden administration giving up a $100 million drone base And who took it? Russia. I mean, it's completely laughable to think that this administration is hard on Russia. No, the Russians took it in Niger. It's a $100 million drone base that we just basically gave to the Russians. Let's talk about Ukraine. They were talking about statements and everything. You know, if you look, leading up to the war in Ukraine, it was Trump that was providing lethal aid to Ukraine. Then Biden comes in and Biden starts to make all these ridiculous statements that we would, quote unquote, tolerate a minor incursion into Ukraine. Like we would be okay if the Russians took a slice of Ukraine. He should have continued to give lethal aid to the Ukrainians to prevent the war from taking place. Instead, Biden was busy, I guess, sending them blankets and well wishes instead of the Javelin missiles they needed. There was a comment about Trump not trusting the intel community. Is this the same intel community that told us that Kabul would stand for years and Kiev would fall within days? I mean, maybe he was right not to trust what the IC said because they've been right so many times before. There was a comment about a prisoner being released from a theater internment facility in Afghanistan. That prisoner was released. He was released under President Biden right before with the withdrawal. So Biden gave up the Bagram Air Base, released the theater internment facilities, which of course houses terrorists, and then one of those terrorists, of course, blew up Abbey Gate, killing 13 U.S. service members, directly attributable to Joe Biden. The Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords, great thing. But the Abraham Accords came about because the Obama administration was so bad with foreign policy that them pushing this ludicrous idea of having an Iranian nuclear deal, it actually drove the Arab states to the Israelis against the Persians. And it was President Trump who then capitalized on that and was able to work out the Abraham Accords between many of the Arab states and the Israelis. It was heading in a very good direction, which led to the attack of September 7th because Hamas, Iran, and other nefarious actors saw the Saudis and the Israelis and the other Gulf states getting close, and they needed something to drive a wedge. And of course, they knew they could get away with an attack with, again, a weak Biden administration. And let's talk about the Houthis. Delisting the Houthis from the terrorist watch list is an absolute sin. And somebody said something, our allies respect Joe Biden. How would you like to be one of our allies in Saudi Arabia? And it's okay when the Houthis are attacking them. They're not terrorists when they're attacking the Saudis. But the second they start attacking Americans, then they're terrorists. They were terrorists from the beginning to the end. It just shows where our priorities are and how we won't defend our allies. So what's been said, and there was also some comment about the American people. If you pull up any polling data on this, right, you could do a poll tomorrow. The vast majority of Americans trust President Trump over Joe Biden on foreign affairs. Irrefutable. I'll try to pull it up if another gentleman would yield me more time. But with that, I yield back and I thank my friend from Texas.
Thank my friend from Chairwoman. My friend, Mr. Westerman, just a couple quick questions. The ranking members talked about somehow this is good for, individuals who are, quote, polluters. I know at least one of the bills we're talking about is important with respect to the Duluth complex, right? And that would, it could constitute a sizable portion. I've got 88% down in my notes, but I know it's a very large percent of the cobalt reserves in the United States. Currently, we're highly dependent on China for cobalt, correct?
Very dependent on China for cobalt and many other minerals and rare earth elements.
And is it not true that the Biden administration, with its senseless, job-killing, hard-working American, life-destroying tailpipe rule that will stack up more mandates on electric vehicle production to the tune of something like 2/3 of the production by 2030, meanwhile EVs are piling up on the lots of automobile dealerships across the country, that in light of that even if one were to say that we should be moving towards electric vehicles, which I think is a reasonable question to debate in and of itself, would it not be foolish to do that on the back of Chinese production and Chinese cobalt mining?
I believe so, and I think you've done a great job of outlining what I would call Democrat utopia. We're going to have our cake and eat it too. We're going to get rid of fossil fuel. We're going to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. Everybody's going to drive an EV, and we're not going to mine anything to create the components that go into that EV, or to strengthening the grid, or to building wind and solar and more distributed electrical systems. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a not in my backyard mentality that is forcing our supply chains more and more to China, who has gone out and hoarded resources from around the world. Cobalt is one you mentioned that comes from the Congo, where they use child slave labor.
Child slave labor, right.
They haul it back to China, where they refine it. And by the way, China built 50 gigawatts of coal-powered plants last year. That's one every 5 days, so they can process the minerals and manufacture the stuff to sell to us so that we can save the planet. It makes absolutely no sense.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's more affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt, I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about a 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that this sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota's not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only, because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there, because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles, and then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China, and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production and AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth, but we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice, and I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from. And to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be quick. I mean, I'm thankful for the legislation on that supports hunters and fishermen. I mean, I think, the more time a child spends.
Texas. Thank my friend from Pennsylvania. I would ask my friend from Texas, Chairman, we've glossed over the impetus behind this, and I recognize that I think everyone in this room would acknowledge the horrific events of October 7th. But, there was, for example, a Time magazine article, the worst 45-minute film you will ever see, which is referencing the film that I think many in this room have seen or at least seen parts of. In the way they describe it, the appalling record of Hamas brutality has set a new standard in graphic evidence of unrivaled human atrocities. In the aftermath of October 7th, brutal massacre of 1,400 innocent Israeli civilians, including mass rapes, tortures, bonding and immolation of toddlers, beheadings, and live mutilation. The Israeli leadership wrestled with how to show the world these horrors without desecrating the memory and dignity of these victims, while also attentive to the privacy and suffering of the victims' families. Massive, horrifying video and photographic imagery of the grotesque scenes was available through the sickening scenes which greeted Israeli rescuers who found new victims alive. But even more footage was provided by the gleeful terrorists themselves from their own body cameras, dash cams, and the devices of victims as they were slaughtered. That's what happened. That's what happened. And when that sort of thing, when America's been attacked and when that sort of thing has happened, and when FDR sat in this very building, in the chamber in which we serve, and he described the day of infamy, and he went through and describing what had occurred when we were attacked by Japan, and then set out to say that we weren't to declare war, that we were in a state of war. And when he described all that, what he did not do was outline what the proper casualty ratio is. He said that we would win. And if I'm the Prime Minister of Israel, my goal is to win. Nothing more, nothing less. It is to win. It is to defeat the enemy that wants to eradicate my people and my country. Would we call on any leader of any sovereign nation to take a different approach when attacked brutally, and not just in a single event, not just some single moment? I would ask the chairman how aware he is, which I'm sure is quite aware, of the extent to which the population, by any objective poll, by international organizations and media, of the people in Gaza, of what their perspective is on the appropriateness of the attacks by Hamas on Israel. Can the gentleman speak to that?
Well, there's massive celebration in the streets. Mr. Meeks and I visited the Prime Minister right after October 7th. And first thing he did is he showed the video of the Hamas attacks. And he's a very strong man. I've never seen tears in his eyes. Those are his own people. And he said, I want you to show this to Congress so they know what they did to my people, and I want them to remember it. And so we did. And we showed the video. Now I was in Kfar Aza, the kibbutz on the border with Gaza. And to know that that entire community was wiped out, and the daycare center, the children were burnt alive, and the grotesque manner with which they carried themselves out. Israel does not target innocent civilians, Hamas does. Israel did not start this conflict, Hamas did. And Israel has the right to finish it. And the thing I find most egregious with this administration is that they're tying the hands of our greatest ally in the Middle East, and they're not allowing them to finish the job by Joe Biden saying, if you go into Rafah, I will cut off all weapons. What does that mean? And what kind of message is that sending to the rest of the world? I will cut off your weapons if you go into Rafah, which is the only way, sir, we can finish, that Israel can finish this conflict. You compare it to 9/11, they experienced what is 20 times 9/11 on October 7th. And they're going to do this with or without us. But I say we stand with our ally and not abandon her at this critical point in time. And that's what I'm worried that this administration is doing.
I agree with the chairman, and I would note that there is a significant amount of polling. Here's one poll being conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is funded by European Union and the United States-based Ford Foundation, which says that 71% of Palestinians in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank believe Hamas made the right decision in attacking Israel. This is from March. There's additional polling that would suggest, for example, that 91% of Palestinians, according to the survey, do not think Hamas has committed war crimes. And 93% say the terrorist organization did not commit the well-documented acts of rape and civilian slaughter that took place on October 7th. My point being is it not also true that there is a significant, lack of clarity with respect to Hamas and the members of who might make up, for example, the battalions that the gentleman described, and the civilian population, and where those lines bleed? Is that not an accurate reflection of the difficulty with which Israel is faced with dealing with taking out the enemy combatants?
Absolutely. But the fact that they use their own people as human shields in hospitals, they take the hostages. This is why it's so difficult for Israel to go in. They want to protect innocent civilians, but it's Hamas that puts their own civilians at risk. It's Hamas that's blocking the checkpoints to block humanitarian assistance from coming in. They just killed 3 Israeli soldiers trying to bring humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and Egypt now is blocking the Rafah. Look, this is going down a very dangerous path in my view. If the optics are that we're now in defense of Hamas over Israel, and that's what, unfortunately, the optics are looking that way with this decision by the administration. Now, I understand, I know my friend is well-intended here, but in that part of the world, they understand power and strength. This looks like a weak moment to me, and it sends a really dangerous message to our adversaries.
Has it not been a dominant theory of the way we carry out our engagement in war to go in and just level the enemy, right? Was that not essentially the way we carried out our operations, for example, in Iraq in 2003 or Desert Storm?
Israel is the only country I know that gives leaflets to evacuate.
Right.
Did Hamas give that opportunity to the Israelis? I don't think so. But they are giving 4 weeks to have innocent civilians evacuate. No other nation at war has done something like that. And I would say that, again, the ratio here is far better than our attempts in Mosul. That was 5-2. Here it's 2-1. West Point Academy says in urban warfare, the ratio is typically 9-1.
9-1, right.
That's
and
West Point
the United
Academy.
Nations has that data as well.
And the United Nations, and I would say that Israel is exercising great caution to protect innocent lives.
Would it surprise the chairman to know that there's sources that show that Israel has made over 70,000 direct phone calls, sent over 13 million text messages, left over 15 million pre-recorded voicemails to notify civilians that they should leave combat areas, that they've given, in many cases, weeks of warning for civilians to evacuate the major urban areas of northern Gaza before it launched its ground campaign in the fall, that they dropped over 7 million flyers and deployed technologies wherever they could to try to ensure that people had ample room to get out from the attacks when they're trying to target the areas where Hamas had purposely embedded within the civilian populations while they would carry out their attacks on Israel from those positions?
That is all correct. And they're doing the same thing in Rafah right now to allow the opportunity for evacuation. No other nation on earth has ever gone to this extent to protect innocent civilians.
We've covered this. We've covered the ratios. I think that all of the evidence that I've looked at certainly points to the fact that Israel, frankly, may be studied for a long time in our military academies and in how one carries out warfare, particularly urban warfare in the modern context, on how to conduct such an operation in a way to get the result that you want to destroy the enemy while trying to minimize civilian deaths. Would the chairman agree?
We've never had a humanitarian zone set up in the middle of a war zone. So Israel, you're correct in this analysis. And, for us to tie one hand behind their backs right now is the worst thing we can do.
Yeah, and I'll close with this by saying, look, I was fairly public in my opposition to our overall omnibus spending package for a variety of reasons that don't really address this specific issue. I opposed the foreign aid package for a variety of reasons involving both our lack of border security, my concerns in advancing with Ukraine without as clear of a mission as I think we should have, but in significant part with respect to the piece involving Israel, because of my concern that the $9 billion would be used in ways that would actually be counter to Israel, and my concerns in talking to people in Israel that it could be used that way. I understand my colleagues that reach a different conclusion on the balance of the interest, but my point of bringing that up is just to say, look, here we are. We have funded our regular, $4 billion-ish of MOU in the regular appropriations package. And we've got now was this 14 billion or 17 billion that was in the supplemental?
16, I think.
16.7 billion in the supplemental for Israel. And the administration, Congress having literally just acted to do this, and the administration is going to say, this administration knows best, when in fact it was this administration who this isn't the first time, right? They recently abstained from the United Nations Gaza ceasefire resolution, correct?
Correct.
The Biden administration tried to restart the failed Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which would further legitimize and empower Iran, while we're currently removing the sanctions that are empowering Iran, which is undermining Israel, correct?
Correct, and the best thing we did in the supplemental is we reapplied those sanctions on energy and drones and rockets. Yeah.
And the Biden administration has let Iran access upwards of approximately $50 billion in revenue through this lack of sanction enforcement, correct?
Correct.
And the president then came into office, he restarted UNRWA, right? He took the affirmative step to restart UNRWA, which President Trump had stopped. We, Congress, had to step in and tell the administration in the appropriations package, stop funding UNRWA, something we'd been calling for. I introduced legislation 3 years ago to defund UNRWA, and we fought for it. We got that put in place. Why? Because finally they woke up on October 7th and said, oh, I guess some of these UNRWA folks are, in fact, saddling up and in bed with the terrorists. Correct?
That's all correct.
I appreciate what we're trying to do here. Obviously, there's some limits in what we can get out of the Senate, getting the president to sign a bill that would undermine his own authority, but the power of the purse is important. I'll close by just saying I wish we had used the power of the purse before we fully gave it up in order to stop the administration from doing this, but we are where we are, so we can try to use this. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Roy from Texas.
I thank the chair. Appreciate the gentleman from appearing. Just a couple of questions. For the chairman, I think you just articulated some of the things I wanted to make sure was clear for the record about what we're talking about here. Under current law, but I want to make sure it's clear for everyone to understand. Under current law, if a state wants to ensure that it is only a citizen voting, does that state face barriers to ensuring that that is the case?
100%, that's an accurate statement. They're not allowed they're actually prevented from asking applicants for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship under current law, and that's the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 of Arizona versus Intertribal, their review of NVRA and federal preemption.
And as such, has that caused problems, for example, with respect to Arizona, where Arizona currently basically operates two separate systems, where they register individuals checking proof of citizenship for state and local elections, but they, on the federal side, do not, because of this barrier put in place prohibiting them, in essence, due to the court's interpretation of MVRA, prohibiting them from being able to check citizenship. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
And what we're endeavoring to do here, which obviously was debated and amended in committee, if I'm correct, I believe that the ranking member's amendment was offered in committee and failed 6-1.
That's accurate.
And there was a significant number of Democrats not present at that hearing.
6-1 indicates that.
Right. And so that amendment was offered. There was, at least debate with the one Democrat who was present, given that there were no other Democrats present at the hearing. But with respect to what we're trying to do with this legislation, we're trying to first make sure that barrier is brought down, but go a step further, given the extent to which we now have, and I would ask the chairman if he agrees with me, increasing evidence that there are jurisdictions seeking to register non-citizens to vote, at least at allegedly the state and local level, but wink, wink, nod, nod, don't worry, we'll never have those registrants being involved in federal voting. But the truth is, there's an expansive view in Oakland, San Francisco, New York, tried to happen here in the District of Columbia, right? We had a vote on that here in the House. So would the gentleman agree what we're seeking to do is to do what many states do right now and attempt to do, but are prevented because of the Supreme Court opinion, require a documentary proof of citizenship to be able to vote in federal elections, to be able to address this problem?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we're trying to do with this legislation, is allow states to have that opportunity to provide documentary proof of citizenship. In fact, require it. And I think you correctly note this administration is working aggressively to roll out a secretive plan on voter registration. In fact, they put forward an executive order, 14019, requiring every agency to put forward a strategic plan as to how they were going to help get out the vote, in effect. And they won't provide us with that strategic plan. I've subpoenaed the 15 administration officials to get that, because I think taxpayers deserve to know how their taxpayer dollars are being used. So you have this administration working in secret to try to roll out and utilize the federal government to get a get-out-the-vote operation. We're, in contrast, just trying to make sure that U.S. citizens are the ones who are voting in U.S. elections.
Gentlemen, aware with respect to the problem we're identifying that our colleagues have suggested does not exist, that there is a significant amount of evidence of people who are non-citizens voting in our elections. A study, for example, professors at Old Dominion University and George Mason University from 2014, finding that non-citizens participate in U.S. elections, and that this participation has been large enough to change meaningful election outcomes, including electoral college votes. Are you aware of that study?
Yeah, yes, and we've looked at a number of examples in our committee hearing. I actually think one of the most pertinent examples is the congressional review of the 46th congressional district race in California in 1996, where they actually did a retrospective analysis on who voted. And it was documented that 624 non-citizens voted in that election. And if we extrapolate that across 435 House districts, or you just look at it at a House district where we know often House races are determined by less than 600 votes. We have a colleague from Iowa where it was 6 votes. And so there is documentary proof of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, and this is why your legislation is so essential.
And it's true that there are multiple states in which in the electoral college process are states that have been determined by thousands of votes, right? I mean, 10,000 votes in Georgia, less than that in certain other states, 15,000, so those votes are meaningful.
In my home state of Wisconsin, a landslide is 20 or 30,000 total votes. I mean,
Right.
a few thousand votes here or there can swing any battleground state.
The study that I quoted from Old Dominion George Mason estimated that 6.4% of non-citizens voted in the 2008 election, which would represent 1.2 million non-citizen votes cast. I do want to, with all respect, correct my friend from South Carolina. There was a report out of Texas of a number that he quoted about 95,000. He said almost 100,000. That number was later corrected to be 25,000. There was a mistake in the counting. But for the record, there were 25,000 in Texas in that report. Virginia last year removed 1,481 voter registrants for non-citizen status. North Carolina conducted a study in 2014 with over 1,400 registered voters. In 2024, an audit carried out in Ohio flagged 137 individuals. There's list after list after list. And I would note that there are examples. I assume my colleague is aware of certain of our Democrat colleagues, one in particular in January of 2024, saying, quote, "I need more people in my district just for redistricting purposes," in a direct response to the border crisis. Does the gentleman remember that
Very much so.
statement? In other words, the idea that there's not a problem is belied by the facts. The idea that there's not a problem with respect to our border is, of course, belied by the facts. And I'm always entertained by this notion that, well, it's illegal already. Why do you guys need to do this? Well, number one, well, then what are you worried about? Number two, if it being illegal solves the problem, then the fact that it is illegal for people to enter the United States, you would think would solve this rather enormous problem of millions of people being released into the United States, correct?
That's spot on.
Yet here we sit. I would note, in addition, that we've got some people raising issues about that this will cause a burden to those who wish to vote for citizens. Is the gentleman aware is that the list of items that we put in the legislation mirrors numerous existing state laws? For example, that bastion of wingnuttery, the state of Massachusetts. The language that we put in the bill is very similar to that which is put forward by the state of Massachusetts. Does the gentleman agree?
Yep.
And the documentation that we talked about, we have provisions replete in the bill to allow people and allow administrators to create mechanisms, for example, for women, spouses who change names, individuals who want to be able to provide a different route to be able to provide evidence if they run into a barrier with, coming up with a passport or a real ID, or in the military examples. Is that correct?
The EAC opportunity to provide that guidance to states is a key component of the bill.
And a last, I think, important point, which is the extent to which this is very inherently a role for Congress and a federal issue. The extent to which the Constitution very much contemplates that, of course, the time, place, and manner of holding elections, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, right? Then you follow the jurisprudence and you figure out, okay, there's some debate about whether the how versus the who, that question which the court has raised. In this case, of course, the Constitution contemplates that the naturalization clause puts Congress, frankly, the court has placed it maybe even higher than intended, Congress at the full center of making determinations about all things naturalization. So the combination of the Elections Clause and the Naturalization Clause, combined with the numerous amendments, the 15th, 19th, 24th, 26th, all referencing, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, I think clearly demonstrates the power and the duty of Congress to act in this case. Would the gentleman from Wisconsin agree?
I agree.
And so at the end of the day, we have the power, we have the duty, we have legislation to resolve a very real and growing problem. We have 80+% of Americans wanting us to solve said problem and guarantee that only citizens vote. We have put forward legislation to do that under the powers that we have under the Constitution. We are solving a real barrier to states being able to conduct their duty to do this and providing a mechanism for federal elections only, a requirement that it be consistent across the country. Is that a fair characterization?
It's fair.
I yield back. Chair, I'll be brief. Thank you guys for appearing. Mr. Duncan, isn't this just a tax on the American people?
Yes.
Does it make sense to tax the American people and then complain about needing to have federal subsidies to help people who, lower income folks who can't afford their power and electricity?
It makes no sense to me.
Does this help or hurt China?
It helps China.
Does this bill help or hurt China?
This bill would hurt China.
Hurt China and help us, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I try to keep things in pretty basic form. We are taxing the engine of economic prosperity for the United States we are taxing the American people. This legislation by Republicans is an attempt to stop radical progressive Democrats from continuing to tax hardworking Americans, hardworking American families, increase their power bills, make us more beholden to China, none of which, in this, will anything under our current law, and anything that we're doing, will it not continue to perpetuate the fact that China is increasing exponentially their production of greenhouse gas emissions?
China's building a new coal-fired power plant every 30 to 60 days. Their greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, as they are across the globe, because now we have a pause on LNG exports that would help benefit folks from all over the globe. At the same time, China has most of the rare earth minerals across the globe. They have rights to it, they're mining it, and they're doing it in a very environmentally insensitive way. Nobody does it better than the United States from an environmental standpoint. But yet we've seen this administration, the last Democrat administration, continue to take those areas where we have the rare earths that we could mine in this country off the table for mining and production. And we're seeing in Mr. Stauber's state where they want to stop copper mining. Well, if you think about copper, copper's needed for winding electrical motors, copper's needed for transmission of electricity. Copper's a valuable resource in the production of steel. But if we're going to end the copper mining, then we're going to ultimately end steel production in this country, and that weakens America.
Would we not do more for the environment by increasing natural gas production and have the environmental impact of electrifying every vehicle in the United States, putting solar on every household in America, and adding 54,000 industrial-scale windmills? If you replace coal power, for example, with American LNG, isn't that the rough equivalent? Because that's what I have as a quote from EQT Corp CEO Toby Rice. In other words, our move to natural gas was dramatically reducing the production of greenhouse gases, right? And this country was leading the world. And this president comes in and has a full-scale assault on natural gas production. The one thing that was actually dramatically changing and turning around greenhouse gas production. And all we're trying to do, frankly, is dent that with this bill in order to peel back part of what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing in terms of propping up and subsidizing. By the way, 90% of the subsidies going to billion-dollar corporations. Does the gentleman agree?
I agree with you.
I'll yield to the gentleman from New York, or I'll yield time back. But I would just say I appreciate the legislation. It escapes any logic or common sense for a nation, such as we are, a nation, to undermine its own prosperity, its own economic security, its own national security, deferring that national security to one of our sworn enemies, China, undermine the ability of the American people to prosper, all in the name of a singular supposed objective, which is reduction of greenhouse gases in pursuit of a climate agenda, which, if you look at the evidence, would have a minimal impact at best. A minimal impact at best. So what are we trying to do as Republicans? Try to say, guys, perhaps we can refocus our efforts, reopen up American natural gas, ensure that we can do that in a way that will help benefit American families while making our economy strong, while making a stronger national security perspective. And oh, by the way, if you really want to get rid of CO2 production, then double down on nuclear production. But if we're going to keep producing windmill farms and solar farms, polluting the entire landscape with this stuff that you then have to dig holes and then bury this crap because you can't actually undermine, you can't get rid of it, while you're using mountains of fossil fuels to produce them in the first place, which is what we're doing. And then we pretend we're not doing it while we decimate our own economy. So I appreciate the gentleman. This is frankly, a very minor step that we should take. Well, I think thank the chairman. I'd ask my friend from Arizona, when he was just describing, we're talking about the issue of the border, and obviously we've got legislation here talking about the impact on local law enforcement. We had a hearing in the Budget Committee last week, which we had testimony from the county attorney of Kinney County, Texas, just south of San Antonio, where he was describing the number of crimes. And I don't know if the gentleman saw the news reports from that hearing in which the county attorney from Kinney County, Texas, one of the main thoroughfares in South Texas, was describing approximately 150 crimes in 2021, which was the, last year of the policies before the Biden administration. And that last year, there were 6,700 crimes, 6,700 crimes. The year before, about 6,300 crimes. The year before that, about 3,000 crimes. There have been 15,000 crimes since 2021. And that is a direct consequence, a direct result of the open borders. It is the people of Kinney County who are left holding the bag. The people of Kinney County, whose law enforcement are the ones who have to go respond to this. It was a Kinney County resident who died because the EMT, the ambulance, couldn't get to that individual because that ambulance, the one ambulance they've got in the county of about 3,000 people, was over dealing with people who are there illegally because they're overwhelmed. Why? Because our borders are wide open and we all know it. Because anybody with eyes can see it. That's the truth. And when we talk about the border and we talk about the fentanyl that the gentleman from Arizona was talking about, and I want to turn it over to him to see if he agrees with me on both that point, and I'm sure he has examples in Arizona that I just described in Kinney County, Texas. But that were we talking about the, why don't we have resources between the ports of entry? And the answer is, oh, well, because Republicans won't fund it. Or is it because the Border Patrol is being used at the places where they're having to process people into the country because of the blatant abuse of asylum and parole laws? Parole, which is supposed to be case by case. Parole, which was 400,000 last year under parole. By the way, how many of those were flown around the country to various places around the United States? All these parole abuses, by the way, had we passed H.R. 2 instead of the fraudulent cover bill the Democrats put forward, which couldn't even get out of the Senate, by the way. I want to blame it on President Trump. They couldn't even get it out of the Senate. They're in the majority. They couldn't even get it moving. That bill would not have dealt with the asylum issues. H.R. 2 would have, and Laken Riley is dead specifically because an individual was paroled into the United States in violation of the law requiring case-by-case analysis. Would the gentleman from Arizona respond to that?
Yeah, a lot to respond to. I'll just tell you in Del Rio, when I've been in Del Rio, talking to their fire chief, he'll tell you the exact same thing. They've got 3 ambulances for that whole region, and many times they'll have 2 ambulances that are taken up with dealing with illegal aliens. They've got the river, they've got drownings, they've got people coming across, and sometimes they basically have put together a team that is 1 ambulance 24/7 to deal with assisting illegal aliens so their own residents get delayed care. Talk to the administrator of the hospital there. He will tell you, yeah, these people get brought in here who are illegally in the country, and our local residents have to go behind them sometimes. Yuma, Arizona, the hospital, they have 1 hospital in a town of about 100,000 people. In that hospital, they'll tell you the exact same thing. Crime is up. They'll tell you the same thing in Cochise County, where in a small town of 20,000 people, every day they have multiple high-speed chases. What from? Illegal aliens, human and drug smuggling. Not through a port of entry, but between the port of entry. Got a video just the other day of, once again, they've started actually, Mr. Roy, I think you can appreciate this. In Arizona, where we don't have fencing in a lot of places, they're literally, I've got a video of them laying down on a barbed wire fence, a ramp where the truck goes up and over.
Yep.
So you're exactly right. What you're saying is true. And this notion that we're trying to fearmonger, we're not trying to fearmonger. And I just have to point out, can I just point out one other thing that the ranking member from Judiciary said? He basically said, you know, we don't know. Maybe Philadelphia had a deficit in 1 year, and so they had to cut their police department. So what he's essentially saying is it's okay for the local government to cut police funding for whatever reason, but it's not okay to examine that for the federal. And we don't just have 1 year of bad money. We're looking at $35 trillion in national debt, and so you got to take that into account as well. And so I'll yield back to you.
Well, what I would note, and I'll just ask the gentleman if he has a similar situation in Arizona, I don't know how much the people of Arizona have had to pay out of their own pocket in order to do the job that the federal government refuses to do. Because I can tell you in Texas, we have spent about $13 billion in Operation Lone Star since 2021 in trying to make sure we do the job the federal government refuses to do. Our DPS troopers are down in South Texas. Our DPS troopers are the ones who are having to police the counties because our local law enforcement can't do the job. Our DPS troopers are not able to be up in North Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, East Texas. They're not able to be policing our roads, policing the fentanyl traffic up through the cities, which does get in through the ports of entry. Because even if you're capturing X percent of it, Y percent of it is still getting through the ports of entry, and a crap ton is still getting in between the ports of entry. So you need law enforcement to be able to go stop it when it's going up I-35, up through the guts of our cities, or going across I-10, all the way from Houston over to El Paso. Our people are the ones left holding the bag and dealing with that. Our people are the ones who are getting killed. The 6 kids in the school district in which I live and where my family lives who died from fentanyl poisoning last year. I assume the gentleman understands the extent to which Texas, at $13 billion, I assume the people of Arizona have had to spend hundreds of millions, billions, I don't know, of dollars to do the job the federal government refuses to do in our constitutional system of government.
Yeah, we obviously are a much smaller state, about 7 million plus in our state. We haven't had to spend $13 billion. You've got a governor who cares. Our governor in Arizona, the first thing she did is she disbanded our borders task force within our DPS. Second thing she did is she took down barriers that we had that have never come back up. And we actually have literally hundreds of miles in Arizona that, I shouldn't say hundreds, we're just under 100 miles that actually have no fence whatsoever, no river, no natural barrier. Why? Because there is we've got 2 tribes that don't want any fencing on there. So we have 4-strand barbed wire fence. So the reality is we have folks coming in, and I don't think you'd gotten here yet. I mentioned this in a meeting with Tucson Sector Chief Modlin last week. 2018 to 2021, encounters in the Tucson sector averaged 60,000 a year. It went up to, when our new president came in, it went up to 130,000 the next year, more than double. Then it went up to 250,000. Last year it was up to 380,000. And already they're on pace. They've already they've outpaced the entire last year. They're on pace to go over 700,000 encounters this year. Mr. Roy, that means that there's no place for those people to go. They're getting processed by agents. That's why I can drive along literally miles along the road with no agents ever coming into contact, but I can sure tell you, I come in contact with the illegal aliens crossing.
And so this legislation, the Police Our Border Act, in order to get more information on the impact on law enforcement is useful in the current environment where we're dealing with not just federal law enforcement, but state and local. And I would note that, we've got, I can't remember, I don't have the stats in front of me. If I can get them, I'll try to present them to the committee or to the gentleman, but thousands of pounds, I can safely say that, thousands of pounds of fentanyl has been intercepted by DPS, Texas DPS, who have been deployed by Texas to South Texas to deal with the fact that we're not intercepting it at the border. So that's the reality of what we're having to deal with and what we're having to spend money on. So the impact on law enforcement is very real. I can tell you, in talking to DPS agents and the head of DPS for Texas, that they're having to do that work, and therefore they're not doing other work. So I'm assuming that there's similar impact in Arizona, but I'll move to one other topic, which is just the issue of generally on crime. And we've been talking about it. The gentlelady before referred to that there's no issue with the defunding of police, right? Well, the fact of the matter is the rhetoric and the actions of federal leaders on this topic, in addition to what we've seen by local leaders on this topic, has been very clear and obvious, right? There's been, very obvious statements back in the 2020 timeframe with the issues involving Mr. Floyd, and in 2021, and then all that followed from that. Cori Bush's statement was very public about defunding the police. I don't have to enter it in the record, but it was very public. In fact, it caused Nancy Pelosi in an interview with George Stephanopoulos to say, quote, "With all due respect in the world to Cori Bush, that is not the position of the Democratic Party." Yet if you go through and look at quote after quote after quote of numerous members of the Democratic Party and the actions of Democrats across the country, it has led to a massive defunding of police around the country. It is undeniably and factually true. in Austin, where we had a significant defunding of the police in Austin. We are now 350 police below the level we're supposed to have, below the level we had 4 or 5 years ago. We have rampant crime skyrocketing, the highest levels of crime we've had in Austin forever. Again, that is a state and local issue. I grant that. The issue is that our Democratic colleagues use the rhetoric of defunding the cops and have been talking about that for the better part of 4 or 5 years. And in fact, and I'll give the gentleman from New York, with whom we've had some incredible agreement lately with respect to FISA and other issues, which has been nice. It fell just short on that one amendment. I wish we had passed. But
212 to 212.
I know, it's 212 to 212, I know. But there was the event, and I'm sure the gentleman knows this and will respond to it, but I want to give him the chance to, where the gentleman joined with our colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, in a letter involving the with respect to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority about officers in the subways to reduce crime. And it was a letter to say that, well, we don't need that funding. And the gentleman signed it. This is a letter in roll call. There's a story on this that says the letter to then Governor Andrew Cuomo opposed a plan to put 500 new Metropolitan Transportation Authority officers in the subways to reduce crime. Your colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, said she and her fellow members wrote that the MTA funding for increased police presence in the subways would be better spent on, quote, desperately needed resources like subway bus maintenance and service improvements. The subway system is now safer than before. And I'll let the gentleman respond, but I mean, observers and people that I know looking at the evidence and obviously the things that we're seeing happening on subways, and I'm a big fan of going to New York and riding the mass transit in New York and have been historically. But there's a lot of concerns by a lot of people being raised about the state of affairs there, in addition to what's happening in D.C. But I want to give the gentleman a chance to respond.
There is indeed a lot of concern, and properly so. And I don't know what Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's motive was for supporting that decrease. I supported it because it was part of an arrangement, as I alluded to before, to shift resources to the Department of Social Services because it was judged that we needed social services for the mentally ill people in the subway system, and that the Department of Social Services was better equipped to provide those services than was the police department. Police are not trained in how to deal with mentally ill people, at least not as well as people from the Department of Social Services. So we took I forget how much money it was, we took a certain amount of money from the police department and shifted it to the Department of Social Services to provide, in a better way, we thought, what was necessary in the subway.
Does the gentleman think that's been working out?
We still have problems, but I think it's somewhat better than it was.
Well, I would be respectful and just say, look, this legislation, the stuff that we have before us, is trying to make sure that we're clear that D.C., where we have a very clear impact on what's happening here, that we're making sure that we're safe in our nation's capital, that broadly speaking, we're making sure we're getting the information about the burden on law enforcement with respect to the border, which is having a massive impact, and then ensuring that we're condemning calls for defunding the police around the country, and that is distinct from what we've been dealing with and talking about some of the issues involving federal agencies. And one thing that was posited earlier, that it was, quote, our job to fund federal law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there is a role for the federal government in coordinating interstate crime, interstate criminal activities, and coordinating among the states to do that. But the extent to which we have a call for a national police is not something that is, I think, central to the constitutional framework, and is, in fact, something that we ought to be working carefully to stay out of the way of local and state governments to be able to police crime and coordinate across states rather than trying to consume power into the federal government. I was happy to work just this week to stop legislation that I thought was going to overly criminalize and federalize crime. I had some conversations with my Democratic colleagues along those lines of trying to prohibit, to limit that. So hopefully there's some ways in which we can agree, and I'll yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.